Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. We made it to the last day with the last panel, and we have a really good panel, so hopefully everybody's looking forward to it. So normally we do this panel every year. This is one of my favorite panels because we usually talk to like the winners or talk about investigative stories, which I think are the most impactful type of stories that we do. For this particular year, we're also doing a multi-platform component, which I'm sure makes sense to a lot of folks because regardless of whether you're on TV, print, or online, everybody has to do multi-platform stuff at this stage. And so it's great to be able to hear from folks who actually have experience and use that in their everyday work and how it affects their jobs, and also to provide, I guess, tips to people as well. Whether you're starting out or if you're a veteran reporter who just wants to know more about this kind of stuff. So first off, I will have our panelists introduce themselves and say where they work and what they do. So, Carol.
Hi. Can you all hear me? My name is Caroline Spivack. I'm a reporter at Crain's New York Business. I primarily cover climate and transportation, but we often write about the intersection of those beats with housing and commercial real estate.
My name is Claudia Chacin. I'm an investigative reporter at the Miami Herald, and the last 2.5 years I've focused on sexual assault allegations.
Hi, good morning everyone. I'm Jared Kofsky. I'm an investigative producer for ABC News based in New York. I do a lot of behind the scenes work for shows like Good Morning America, World News Tonight with David Muir, Nightline, and our ABC on television stations. I also report for ABC News radio affiliates. Started out as a real estate print reporter in New Jersey.
Good morning. I'm Maia Rosenfeld. I'm a data reporter for ABC, and I work with the ABC-owned stations. I'm actually based in Philadelphia, and with ABC News with Jared and our investigative producers. And I bring data into the conversation to see how we can broaden the scope of stories, or in the case we'll talk about later, provide supporting evidence for claims that are difficult to prove.
All right, so as you can see, I have a really good mix. I'm really looking forward to what we discuss today. So first, I'm going to ask the panelists in terms of how they were able to sort of get started with like the stories that we're going to be talking today, and pretty much how it came about, what was the big break, what are some of the challenges they faced, and then also the impacts that came out from their stories. So first off, we'll start with you, Caroline. Can you talk a little bit about your story and how it got started?
Yeah, sure. So my story is about retail in the New York City subway system. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, there are hundreds of retail spaces in the subway stations and on platforms. So these are spaces where you find newsstands, retail shops, flower shops, shoe repair, and they're really a remnant of a time when there was a captive audience for retailers, where it was before the age of e-commerce and people would shop and stop in these spaces and shop. But over the years, there's been a real decline, and now we have more than 80% of these spaces are vacant. And the effect of that is that you have an increase in the perception of that it's desolate and unsafe, and that people don't want to spend time in a space where there's this feeling that there's these gritty, empty spaces. So the challenge for the Transportation Authority, the MTA that oversees these spaces, has been to figure out how to revive these spaces when there's so much competition for retail tenants, and it's so much easier to do it above ground. So my story looked into how there can be a turnaround to create vibrancy in these spaces, and what needs to happen there. And really the genesis for that came from being a commuter in the subway system and walking through the system and seeing these spaces and kind of just asking the question, why are so many of them empty? How long has it been like this? What needs to change for them not to be empty? Why is retail, really coming back from the pandemic above ground, but it's not below ground? And the answer was, like a web of, it's very complicated for a variety of reasons, and
also touched on, real evolution in terms of, the city's character and just how people utilize the subway system. And I was able to rope in historical research and interviews that gave that color, something that could have been a bit drier, but that really helped bring it to life for people.
Okay.
And then for you, and how, yeah, sorry about that. Can you talk a little bit about your story? It's not necessarily real estate, but it's like a really impactful story and shows pretty much just how important these types of stories are. Can you talk a little bit how you got your idea as far as doing the story and how it came about?
Yeah, so the first project we worked on was about a local gymnastics coach that had sexual assault allegations that had trailed him for over a decade. It started with a tip from a parent of a 7-year-old who said that her daughter had been touched and spoken to, but in an inappropriate manner by the coach. And that mom had actually posted on Nextdoor about the coach, and another mom from somebody that took his class 15 years before said, "Please call me." And so it was really through developing relationships with these parents and then, the women who were now adults that we were able to get this story. And we were also, through public records, we requested police reports. Turns out this coach had been reported to police about 13 years earlier. He had sent a love letter to a 12-year-old while he was a 26-year-old. And so, yeah, public records, the one thing, always show up. We only got those police reports because my colleague went into the police station. They had told her no over email because it was under active investigation, but she showed up and got them somehow. So you might get lucky. And then, more recently, we started working on the Alexander brothers investigation, which was broken by the Real Deal. Amazing job. But, since they were raised in Miami, we started looking into, their high school allegations, and really developing relationships with victims who wanted to speak to us.
Right. And up next, we got a twofer. So Jared, can you talk, Jared and Maia, can you guys talk about your story and how it came about? This one's a really good story, especially in these politically charged times. It's like these type of stories, it's usually about giving a voice to the voiceless, and I think that's one of the more important things that we do. And so, yes, Jared, can you guys talk about it?
Sure, thank you. I will start and then Maia will fill in on all the areas I will inevitably miss. Our series was called Our Inheritance is Washing Away. It was a 2-part series for ABC News Live, which is our streaming service that airs on YouTube, Disney+, Hulu, and a couple of other platforms. We also had a digital component that was on abcnews.com that were text articles. Long story short, this story kind of like yours started with a tip. I got a call out of the blue one day from a man named Timothy Williams who lives in southern Alabama, and he said, his community called Shiloh has been experiencing constant flooding ever since a highway was widened. The highway is US Highway 84, and there was a massive widening project across the south and southwest. 84 goes from Georgia all the way to New Mexico, and there was this effort to get all of these states along the way on board that this should be the next big transportation corridor for this part of the country, and this should no longer be a 2-lane road. This should be a major 4-lane highway, pretty much all the way from Georgia, through Texas and going to New Mexico. And he said, his community is a very unique community. It has been there since Reconstruction. It's a historically Black community where all of the landowners take pride in, their inheritance. Their inheritance is their land. Hence the title, Our Inheritance is Washing Away. His concern was that, as the highway is being widened, there was an elevation, it appeared to the residents, and then water was coming down into the community, causing significant damage to their properties and raising concerns that they might have to leave this community that their families have called home, since the 1860s. And when I got this tip, I was really thinking that, we don't often cover, at first it might seem like a small story, but we really felt like this could resonate with a national audience. And Timothy Williams told me, he said, you need to come and see it for yourself. And fortunately at ABC, I was able to get approval, and I went down there, and it started pouring rain. The magic of TV, fortunately, is that we need to be able to visualize everything, and we couldn't do a story on flooding without there being water. So luckily it rained the day I was there. We were able to get all of it on video, but that was really only where the story started. In order for us to tell this story, we really needed to investigate and use data and documents to figure out, hey, what went wrong here? And Maia's gonna explain a bit about that.
Yeah. So one of the biggest challenges of reporting this story was that we had the clear harm to the residents. We went down there, we saw it, we saw their homes sinking into the mud. We had this highway project, and in theory there was an accountability element, right? The State Department of Transportation that used federal dollars to widen that highway, but they denied that it had anything to do with the flooding. And they continue to deny. To this day, they say, oh no, we elevated the highway, but it had nothing to do with all this flooding that's been happening. Once we started doing some digging, it became pretty clear that they had recognized the role of the highway in the flooding earlier on. So we put in a lot of open records requests for things like plans of the highway and public meetings where residents of the area gave comments about what they were worried it would do to their properties, and actually notes from contractors who were building the highway. As they were building the highway, we had daily diary entries from them talking about homeowners in Shiloh, including Mr. Williams, who came up to them and said, as soon as they started construction, our homes are flooding. And then one of the big discoveries of this case, of this story, was that the state had actually signed settlement deals with several of the Shiloh homeowners that paid them around $5,000. They desperately needed this money to fix their homes, to waive the right to ever sue the state for flood damages. So now we're thinking, why would the State Department of Transportation that says they didn't cause the flooding go into this, whole legal maneuver to protect themselves from future claims? But that's not really, that might show that they might have thought they were worried about the liability, but it doesn't provide the evidence we need to show viewers and show readers that yes, this place didn't flood before, it shouldn't flood for environmental reasons, and what's happening here isn't natural. So that's where we brought in the data. I'm a data reporter. I often find stories in data. This isn't one of them. Jared got this great tip, and this is an example of where the data allowed us to really prove that tip. Not completely prove it, but provide sufficient evidence to demonstrate it. And so first I looked at FEMA flood zone maps, and it was clear this Shiloh area was not in a flood zone. But I also know from other data reporting I've done that FEMA flood maps don't always keep up with conditions like climate change, which increase the risk of flooding in some areas. So we needed to look at forward-looking, future climate modeling data. And we ended up looking at data from the First Street Foundation, which models climate risk, and found that the properties that were sustaining severe flood damage had only a 4% chance of flooding at least once a year during the 5 years since the highway was built for natural environmental causes. And when we looked at weather data and saw that it had rained hundreds of times in that period, and then we went down there and saw what happened when it rained and heard from the residents that it flooded nearly every time it rained, that was 150 times at least over the course of those 5 years. So not just once in each of those years. So we were able to use data and documents to show that this was outside the realm of reasonable outcomes, probable outcomes, and that along with some other storytelling techniques, and as Jared mentioned, visuals, was able to help our story really reach the audience and have some impact.
All right, I like where this is going already. It's interesting too, because of that impact. There was obviously an impact. I mean, in Reno last year, we had to close our one and only Reno schnitzel because of a highway project, and it got eminent domain. And people were like upset. So, and that's for a Wiener Schnitzel. I could only imagine all these poor families, like what they had to go through. And so, yeah, and in fact, like as far as myself, last year I also worked on an investigative piece, and this one was about, it started as a tip as well. I got a call from a lady who was pretty distraught because of what was going on with her dad at this like newly installed Muslim cemetery, at one of the oldest cemeteries in Reno. And so they made an agreement to have like one like vacant part of it turned into a Muslim cemetery. And I'm not sure if folks are aware in terms of how things are for Muslims in terms of like handling bodies and what have you. So, but like moving bodies is a big no-no in the religion. And so in her case, it started with just like the headstone being in the wrong spot. And so there were concerns that like, hey, did they move his body without letting us know? Ultimately, it turned out they just put it in the wrong spot. But like if it weren't for the mom who was there when the body was buried, like everybody was visiting like the wrong person. But so I just kind of started with that, and I go, you know what, I'll start looking around a little bit more, which is what everybody does when they get a tip. And then I found another family, and this time they actually did move the body. They never said that they moved the body, and it was like a huge scandal within the Muslim community. The problem was there was an association that was in charge of that cemetery, the local Muslim association. But the person who led the association didn't want to cause any like trouble because he was afraid they were going to lose the cemetery or whatever. And so he basically didn't go to bat for them. And so now I go, okay, that's like a bit of a bigger deal at this point. And then as I kept looking and looking, like things started to pop up even more. Now I found another family, and they were actually not Muslims, they were in the regular side. And this poor lady has been complaining for 5 years because her poor daughter's gravesite looked like it was like just somewhere on the side of the road. And it was really galling for her because right next to her are like these huge mausoleums of like the really rich Reno families, and those like were really good. They were obviously being taken care of. And so I go, okay, so it looks like it's a problem cemetery-wide. And then just as with like a lot of stories that we do, I go, you know what, maybe there's a public records component to this. Let me see what I can dig up. And so I started I started looking at financial statements and what have you, and the more I looked into it, the more it just got worse. They made like some really bad investments over the years, and so they were like underwater, and then they started doing things like they started charging people to watch the body being buried, like 500, 300 bucks or something, and it just kept getting worse. And then I found like some ex-employees who wanted to talk after they found out I was looking into it, and there was like some nepotism going on. Like everybody in the leadership position was pretty much related to the CEO. It was either the son-in-law, the daughter, like she had 2 daughters in there. And so, and every time people complained, like they had to complain to like one family member, and so they either got in trouble for it or it never went anywhere. But so it was just this big revolving door of issues. And so, like, we eventually ran the story, and it got like heard by people within the state and by local officials, and ultimately, like just 2 weeks ago, the Nevada legislature passed a law to pretty much like correct a bunch of the stuff that was going on with that particular cemetery. And so on that note, obviously, like we do a lot of this type of stuff because of the impacts that we can have and the difference that it can make in the community. Can you guys talk a little bit about, I guess you could also talk about the reporting and some of the challenges you faced, and ultimately how much of an impact like it made in your particular communities, or I guess in your cases, like, yeah, you have a pretty wide audience. But yeah, just talk a little bit about some of the things you did to sort of back up your reporting, kind of like what Maia did, and then ultimately how it resulted in like benefits for your readers.
Yeah, of course. So I'd say I started with going out into the subway system, and I just spent so much time in the subway system walking around because these tenants, so the folks who are actually still operating in these retail spaces underground, the MTA, which is the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, they discourage them from talking. So there's
it was a challenge to get people to talk about what they were experiencing. So it was a lot of just going around, chatting people up, building a rapport, and eventually found some people who were there for a flower shop owner who was there from the 1980s, and he said it was, you know, incredible heyday time for him. He had corporate accounts, he had phone-ins, people were picking up flowers. It was a wonderful experience for him and his family. It was a wealth creation opportunity for them. But over the years, it just completely evaporated with e-commerce and with competition increasingly above ground, and just, you know, why would you buy flowers underground when you can, you know, buy them above ground and they're not covered in, you know, subway soot. You know, so humanizing and finding people that tell those stories was really important, and just building those relationships with business owners in the subway system was really critical. But also source building. As a transportation beat reporter, I interact with NTA officials regularly, and it made it accessing data that was crucial to telling the story through data visualizations and making it really engaging for readers, and why it was important, and understanding why there's an impact on, you know, on shop owners and people who, you know, relied on these businesses for income. You know, that there's a human impact. That data that helped us, you know, chart, you know, the revenue and what was vacant and what was, you know, just build the landscape, build a picture for the reader. That was data that I was really able to access because of sourcing. I filed, you know, FOIL requests as well, but I was able to get a lot of it just through sourcing, which was really helpful in terms of speeding things up, and it ended up really, you know, benefiting the whole package in terms of being able to, you know, provide data visualizations along with photos and videos of the actual spaces that we were talking about. So that was a really big part of the reporting process. And then, you know, ultimately after the story published, which was in the spring of last year, you know, recognizing that there was a real need to revive these spaces somehow, the NTA created a retail activation unit, and they're actively working now to fill some of these spaces. Right now they're trying to get creative with inviting artists to, you know, we have like a little dino bodega where there's like a 7-foot tall, like paper mache dinosaur in one of these, that's like a dino newsstand. And they're doing these like creative, fun activations with the idea of wanting to, for free, working with artists with the idea of like just generating some vibrancy and excitement and interest, and the hope being that that will excite brands and would-be tenants to come back into the system. So they have like a local community group in Queens has a radio station that they actually have their base in a subway station now. So a retail shop has been used for a local radio station. There's local artists that are doing all sorts of things. And I have heard from sources that there's interest from brands to partner with some of these artists, and the idea is really to just get something going and build some vibrancy and also generate revenue so they can help, you know, keep the system going.
And yeah, Caroline started like talking about sourcing a little bit, and I think that's obviously like really important. I know when I do these types of stories, like sources can make or break it, but it's also one of the more challenging ones, especially the more controversial the story is. It seems it's harder to get people to talk. Like in my case, when I did that story, I was able to convince like 2 people who wanted to be anonymous to go public, but there was one person I couldn't convince no matter what, which was unfortunate in one sense because it would have made the story even better because she had a lot of inside information. But on the other hand, I understand why like she wouldn't want to talk to. So especially in your case, can you also talk in the course of your reporting as far as how you were able to get people to talk and how you sort of manage that push and pull in terms of like, because obviously it's a really, really tough situation for a lot of these people. Like, how did you handle that?
Yeah, so what kind of helped us is that this happened in a small island community called Key Biscayne, small municipality, the council members know each other, everybody kind of knows each other. And so when we first spoke to the mother of the now woman who had been assaulted when she was 17, she had told me, you know, I spoke with the then chief of police at the time, I didn't want to file a formal report because I didn't want my daughter to go through that, but I did want to make him aware of what had happened. And so, you know, we reached out to the chief of police, or the then chief of police. He said, I don't remember anything. We reached out again. You know, how often does this happen in your small community that a mother comes to you and says that, you know, her 17-year-old daughter had been assaulted by her gymnastics coach? And then he kind of started, oh, maybe, you know, I think I could have maybe put out, you know, detectives to look at him, to watch him teach, to see if I saw anything, you know, maybe ask for this in public records, maybe ask for that. So he started, and then a third time I called him, and he says, oh, I remember, I spoke to the parks director about it, I spoke to my city manager about it, and I spoke to somebody else in the council about it at the time, and it was just to make them aware and to watch out. And so, you know, after that, we found out that this man had been fired from a community center for carrying a girl inappropriately. But then the same man who fired him continued to give him permits to coach at the community park just across the street from the community center. And so, you know, our focus for that story on the sources was the city, you know, the government officials who knew and did nothing about it, the police, the Parks and Recs director, the chief of police back then. And then in terms of, you know, the actual women who spoke to us and the parents of a 7 and 4-year-old who had problems currently with the coach, it was tough. I think the toughest hurdle we faced was that mother of the 17-year-old didn't want her daughter to know that she had spoken to us. You know, her daughter had gone through some mental health struggles. She was about to get married when we were finishing up. And so, you know, we had to have various conversations with her, letting her know that we can't just publish this, like even if it was anonymous, because it was, we couldn't publish it without talking to her first and getting the okay. We ended up sending a letter to her after she got married, you know, a few weeks after, and letting her know that we'd spoken to her mother. We got her mother to approve it before we sent it, and ultimately she gave us the okay. And in terms of impact, we published on a Friday. That Monday, the women, you know, saw that it was a much bigger deal than they once thought it was. Once they saw the other women that were affected and the young girls that were being affected in present day, and they went to the police. For one, it was the first time she went to the police about it. For another, it was the second, but the first, you know, she was 12 years old and her mom was bringing her because this man had sent her a love letter, and, you know, she lied to the police because she's 12 years old. But, you know, these women went back, told their stories, and he was arrested about a month later.
Yeah, and it's interesting she mentions like the sources that thought it was a bigger deal than they initially thought, because I get that a lot as well. And so, Jared and Maia, did you have the same experience? Can you talk a little bit about like how you did your sourcing?
I can start a bit. So I guess kind of like Caroline mentioned before, you know, for us also it was very dependent on both documents and, you know, actual people who are experiencing this issue, and also people who we didn't expect would be familiar with this issue. The additional challenge, of course, that we have in television is that we need to get people who can talk on camera, which adds an additional layer of complication because people are afraid, you know, who's going to be commenting about them in the YouTube comment section and things like that. We have to make people comfortable on camera, and we were very fortunate in this story. Our correspondent, who, you know, fronts the story on television, who did a lot of the writing for the television component, is Steve Osensami, who is really, really good at making people go on camera in difficult situations. So I worked on a lot of the booking side of things with Maia, and then when it comes to the actual interview, Steve is in the room with our subjects, just making sure that they feel calm, and it's just a conversation. We always have to tell people it's just a conversation, it's not live, you know, there's nothing to worry about. But in terms of finding the actual people who we included, so Timothy Williams, of course, was easy because he reached out to us. We then had the additional challenge of trying to find other residents who would talk with us and additional characters, as we say in television, who would help tell this piece. There were other residents in the community who were not comfortable speaking with us on camera. They were fine talking with us off the record or on background, but they were not comfortable talking on camera. We made multiple attempts, but of course we're not going to force anyone to talk on camera if they don't want to, but the background information that they provided about the settlements and about the flooding that their properties were experiencing, that helped us tell this story. But we really wanted to take it, you know, just beyond what was happening in the Shiloh community. We wanted to show what was happening in other areas nearby. And one thing we found out quickly was around 5 miles west of Shiloh, there was a daycare center that was owned by a white family that also started experiencing flooding. And this daycare center had a very, very different experience once they started voicing concerns about the flooding that was coming, you know, down from the widened highway onto their property. They were in negotiations with the Department of Transportation, and ultimately they had to leave their property, but they were paid $165,000. So when you compare the $165,000 west of Shiloh versus the $5,000 payments with restricted covenants in Shiloh, there were clear differences there. And again, because this is television, we knew we needed to get those daycare owners on camera. Just to be able to, you know, find out from them, you know, what their reaction is to what's happening in Shiloh, and also from their perspective, you know, they lost their family business. I mean, this flooding had significant impacts on people. You know, that was an institution in that community for so many generations of children. But when I tried reaching out to the daycare owners, you know, on the phone, I think they assumed I was a telemarketer calling from New York. I was hung up on, and we knew that that was going to be an important part of this story. And when I went to Alabama, you know, they live at the end of this like dirt road. I walked down this dirt road, there were dogs barking, I left a business card, but they called back. And one thing led to another, and the next day they sat down with Steve for an on-camera interview. And I really think that that was a very important part of this piece because they did not know about the $5,000 payment for either their neighbors 5 miles away. They were horrified by it. We have that reaction on camera, and that helped to tell this piece. A couple other points I just want to address real quickly that helped us with this was that, you know, when you're actually on the ground and you're trying to talk to sources in person, sometimes you meet sources you don't expect. You know, I was shooting B-roll, which, you know, the video that we shoot against kind of filler material in the story outside of like the county office building. And while I was there, a man came out and said, like, you know, what are you doing? And it turns out he was the county emergency management coordinator. And while I was there, I asked him, I said, are you familiar with this flooding, you know, up the street? And we talked briefly, and then we got him on camera the next day. He ended up talking with us about, you know, oh yeah, here's what happened. The state elevated this highway, and this is the reason why they had to do it. So weaving all of those components together into a broadcast form took some time, but we're happy with how it came out and what the impact was, which Maia, if you want to speak to a bit.
Sure, and I'll just mention one more thing on the sensitive sourcing. So as Jared mentioned, some of the other Shiloh homeowners were hesitant to speak with us on camera, and this actually had to do, in many cases, with fear about the settlements they'd signed and the restrictive covenants, which did prevent them from bringing legal claims against the state. But some of them, I think, whether they were intimidated or they just misinterpreted it, they thought that meant they couldn't make claims publicly about the flooding from the highway. So that was a challenge, and another sensitive source that our colleague Steve Osensami did a really wonderful job first convincing to go on camera and then having a really powerful, emotional interview with was one of the homeowner's daughters. Mr. Williams' daughter spoke with us for our follow-up piece, which I'll talk about in a moment. And she spoke to the impact that this has, not just on the community and her inheritance, but on her father and what it's like to watch her father work so hard to protect and watch his community and his home and watch it sink into the ground, and how difficult that was for her to see. So moving on to the impact, that was in our follow-up piece, which was really exciting because we saw some impact soon after our first initial piece exposing this issue. Our video report made its way to, at the time, the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, and he decided to come down to Shiloh and pay them a visit and see it for himself. And so he came down a few months after. We also went down. We were able to get a sit-down interview with him. The residents showed him around, gave him a similar tour to what they'd given us. And he, you know, he had a similar reaction to us, I would say, that we did, and said, this is not something that we can allow to happen. You know, we have to make you whole. I'm going to bring your concerns back to Washington and do something about this. Now, he couldn't state explicitly that the highway had caused the flooding because there was this ongoing investigation by the Federal Highway Administration into the expansion of the highway and the effects on the communities surrounding. So he wasn't able to say that, but it seemed that there was a general consensus that people were concerned. He said he was very concerned about it. And a few months after his visit, there was a settlement announced between the Federal Department of Transportation and the state DOT that had built the highway, and it stopped short of saying that the highway had caused the flooding, but it did require the state of Alabama to make some changes to the highway drainage system to mitigate the flooding. So this was sort of a win and a loss in some ways for the residents. They were happy to hear that, you know, finally, after their years of advocating, the flooding was hopefully going to be mitigated. But they also had homes that were sinking into the mud, in some cases pretty dangerous, could be collapsing. There were insurance reports that talked about how the cracks in their foundations were caused by excessive flooding. And they didn't have the money to fix it. That $5,000 they'd gotten 5 years ago was enough to fix the damage at the time, but they didn't know how bad it was going to get. So we continued to follow their path, advocating for something more compensation or, you know, resources to be able to fix their homes, rebuild at this point, because it's not livable anymore. And they were essentially pointed to federal grants that could help them with this type of resources to rebuild, and it seemed that they were applying places. It seemed there might be good opportunities, and then we all know what happened when with the new administration, there were a lot of grants cut. So many grants specifically targeted to this environmental justice grants were cut. So we've been following them. We've done now, I believe, 6 different digital stories, and their story is definitely not over. I'll say that.
Saga continues.
Yeah, so you guys bring up like a lot of good points. All of you talked about reporting and talking to people. Like, given how this current political landscape is in terms of how reporters are sometimes like treated and stuff. I know it's been challenging sometimes to go out in the field, but it's still important to go out there into the community. I know last year we had like a big issue in the city near Reno called Virginia City. I don't know if folks are familiar with that place, but it's this, like they've had like some bonanza, like TV shows like filmed there and stuff like that. So it's this really old looking town in Reno. And it had a huge scandal last year during like this big car festival for Hot August nights, because some poor guy was coming in from out of state to do a survey on what people thought about capping lawyer fees of all things. And you would think that capping lawyer fees would do well in a conservative place like Virginia City. But I guess people have drunk too much, and this one guy who was being polled was like making all sorts of comments, and then eventually told this poor guy who was African American that there was like a hanging tree back there. And it turned into like a huge like scandal on social media. And so, like, well, first I just wrote a quick story about it, and my editor was like, "Can you go over there and talk to the people who were like, you're sending me like the only Asian guy in the newsroom in Virginia City to talk to people about racism. And so, but I eventually had to go. And it's just funny, like the moment we rolled in there, like with my photographer, as soon as they saw like us with our gear and stuff, people just started looking at us funny. And it was so hard to get people to talk. I was in one shop, and one lady flat out told me to my face, like, I don't trust the liberal media, so I don't want to talk to you. And I finally found like 2 people to talk to. One was like the head of like tourism who has to talk to me, I guess. And another was like somebody who worked at a bar. And the sad part was when the story finally ran, that's when I started getting emails from people wanting to talk, because like, oh, that was such a fair story, blah, blah, blah. Like, I wish you had talked to me before, because before that, all the other stories that came out just pretty much painted the town in a bad light because it was about the incident that happened. And so when you guys go out there, like, do you face challenges such as that, and how do you deal with that, given how important it is as part of the job to still go out there and talk? Like, I guess we could start with you.
Yeah.
Caroline.
I'd say like the biggest challenge that I face with this story in particular was there were actually a lot of shop owners that they blamed in their view, they blamed the media in part as a reason why there was a lack of tenancy in these spaces, that in their view, like some of the city's conservative media was fueling this perception that the subway system is dangerous and that it's crime ridden and that you shouldn't linger. So there was a hesitance to get people to talk for that reason, that they were very skeptical of speaking with me, because of what, that perspective that they were maybe bringing to the conversation. But I think, like just having a very candid conversation about, hey, I want to hear, your experience. I want to hear your side of the story. Like, this is your opportunity to tell me what you're experiencing, why you think things are the way they are, what needs to change. Tell me about what you and your family have experienced. And that, having enough of those conversations with people, you get people who want to share their story, and those walls come down. Especially for something like this, it's not quite as sensitive as some of the other reporting subjects that we're talking about. But like after just having enough conversations, you find those people that are willing to talk.
How about you?
Yeah, I think I have a lot of privilege being on the investigative team. I have more time than the normal person maybe. And one big challenge for us was trying to get the Parks and Recs director, who was the director then, the same that gave permits to this gymnastics coach, was currently and is still the Parks director in Key Biscayne, to talk to us and to give us anything. Emails went unanswered, phone calls went unanswered, and so, I am small, young. I don't often go around with a photographer if I just want to talk to someone and get them on the record, so I think I'm a little bit less intimidating, and maybe, the emails and all that, he might have been intimidated by. So I just showed up. I showed up to his work and I said, hey, I want to speak to Todd Hofferberth. I'm a reporter from the Miami Herald. If he could meet me for like 5 minutes, that'd be great. And he did. He came down, sat across the table from me, and I started asking him, what happened? You heard about it? And he said it was hearsay at the time. And that quote really riled up the residents once we published. But, I was able to get him to say that, remembered the word forever, because how could you not? And, we published it, and about 6 to 8 months later, the village of Key Biscayne issued a gag order on their employees. So they're no longer allowed to talk to the media. So that, thankfully, not thankfully, but we don't cover the island much. And so in terms of follow-up stories we have, but it's a big problem.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead, Jeff.
Sure. One thing I think, what challenge that we had with this story in particular, and this always depends on the story you're working on. Some stories you work on, you're going to find, as with any piece, everyone is super talkative and wants to talk to you. Other pieces you're going to find, closed doors wherever you go. And I do think, as you mentioned, the value of showing up in person, despite all the advances in technology, cannot be underestimated. I mean, an initial issue we had starting out with this piece, at the very beginning, was getting the government to talk. I had sent requests to the Federal Highway Administration in DC, and I was constantly getting this sort of response of, we'll get back to you, and then 1 week goes by and another week goes by. But one thing, the federal government has regional offices in every state across the country. And so when I was in Alabama, I figured, let me just stop by the Federal Highway Administration's office in Montgomery. I just showed up unannounced. Usually no one really goes there unless you're like a highway engineer or something. So when they get a visitor, they're like, oh, who is it? They're not expecting the news to show up. But I usually do this sort of thing, we have what we call in TV an unscheduled interview. But with this sort of thing, we really just wanted information. We were not trying to ambush on camera. I just wanted to know what's going on with this investigation into the Shiloh community. And luckily in that case, we were not able to get, at the time, the U.S. Department of Transportation on camera. Later we had, the secretary, but at least that got the showing up in person got the ball rolling on them, at least giving us a statement that we don't know if we would have gotten otherwise. We were never able to get the Alabama Department of Transportation on camera, but, we made a number of efforts. We were constantly, eventually we finally got a statement from them, I think relatively soon before we published the initial story. But we definitely tried to do our due diligence there as much as possible. But one thing I would just note also, and this is from a separate story, but I just think it shows often that when people see, what often can convince people to ultimately talk, and this is an unfortunate motivation sometimes, but they don't often like seeing how an issue affecting them is portrayed in the media, and they might want to correct the record. And that, I had cases where at Real Estate Journalism Conference, we covered at ABC pretty extensively the attempted foreclosure of Graceland, Elvis Presley's estate. And a key person in that whole story was, there was a notary in Florida named Kimberly Philbrick. And as part of this case, the person, the alleged scammer, well, she's been convicted now, so the convicted scammer who tried to sell Graceland claimed that Lisa Marie Presley had authorized the sale, and that authorization was notarized by a woman named Kimberly Philbrick in Florida. And we really wanted to know, who is Kimberly Philbrick? And initially, we did lots of, we tried to reach out to her for comment, as did basically every media outlet in the world. And she did not want to talk at the time, but then there were all these articles that were coming out that were saying, Kimberly Philbrick was the notary. And in Kimberly's mind, she wanted to correct the record. She did not want to talk to the media at first, but she did not like the way, other media outlets were portraying her. And we, made lots of efforts to get her on camera. And eventually, she agreed to speak with us. And, we had it as a good, exclusive for Good Morning America. The notary speaks out, the notary who saved Graceland. So that kind of thing, in a way, it's unfortunate sometimes that it comes to that situation, but people very often, who initially are reluctant to talk, don't give up because they will change their mind.
Just something to mention, related to the Shiloh story and reluctance to speak on the flip side, we mentioned a few times Pastor Timothy Williams, who was a key voice in our story. We would not have been able to tell this story without him. And he was never hesitant to speak. He had been raising his voice for years, and finally we were listening to him. But that doesn't mean that it didn't come at a cost to him, and that's something that's really stuck with me since we went down there for our follow-up when Buttigieg came down. The night before the big visit, we were at Mr. Williams' home, talking to him about what was going to happen the next day. We actually went to his office. He has two businesses that he runs on his property. One is a restaurant, and one is a cleaning business. And we were in his cleaning business office, and he got a phone call. And it was a customer that was canceling their contract. And he gets off the phone and he tells us, this has been happening ever since that first story aired. And he's heard, because someone came into his restaurant and told him, that it was because he was speaking to us and he was making this public, and the largely white community down the road in Elba was not happy about that. And so they were boycotting his businesses. He didn't get people coming into his restaurants. And this is, he's already struggling financially because of the flooding, and now his livelihoods are being taken too. So that was something that was honestly difficult for me at first. I think I try to, as journalists, I think we all try to think about the impact that speaking out will have also on our sources, and we do what we can. Often we can't do much to prevent that. But this was something I learned from this, that in some cases, I'm not going to be the one to make that decision, whether it's worth it, right? And for him, he continued to speak with us, and to him it was worth it. And it was so important to get the story out there and for people to finally listen to what was happening to his community, that he was willing to accept the consequences. And that was very powerful to me and taught me as a reporter to, of course, consider those impacts and be clear with sources about those impacts when you're trying to persuade them to talk, to not be too pushy. But if they want to share their story, that's their decision to make. And if they understand the potential consequences, which they probably do better than we ever would, that it might be so important to them to get their story out there that it's worth it.
Yeah, and I couldn't stress enough what they've mentioned. Well, it's common sense to a lot of the folks in this place right now, because everybody's pretty experienced, especially for new reporters. When you guys kept saying he's showing up, and then just pressing over and over. Because sometimes even when somebody's ghosting, if I just show up, then for some reason they actually talk, and I was like, oh, that worked. But we have a lot of new young reporters in the newsroom coming in now, and a lot of times we sort of have to remind them it's important to go out there, because they're kind of used to reporting stuff through social media or online and what have you. So we have to impress that upon them. Although one of the good things about the younger folks is that they're used to multimedia. I remember when we were first asked to shoot video many years ago in the newsroom, the older journalists were like, "You want me to do what?" And then it's like, that's why I'm in print. But the younger folks, you ask them to take a video, it's like, "Oh, sure, you want it horizontal or vertical?" And so I know we were going to discuss some multi-platform stuff, given the makeup of the panel, but I also want to make sure I leave enough room for questions since we have 6 minutes. Is there anybody who has questions for the panel? Yes, Mayor.
Well, speaking to the multi-platform package, when you're just doing a print magazine story, you have all this photography in your hand in the olden days or on screen. You're figuring out what to make big, what's going to be in black and white, what's a sepia tone, whatever. In the multi-platform package, obviously you've shot video, you've taken stills, you've written a story, you've voiced it over, all of those things, but how do you decide how to make this package? I know, I think it was in Caroline's, there's this one still photo that's in black and white, and it's very powerful, that's sort of an obvious one, but some things there is more nuance. So what goes through your brain when you're saying, this belongs here, that belongs there, and so you know how to choose?
Yeah, I think for that story in particular, we thought of it as, the way it's formatted, it's like you're entering a subway station and you're taking the reader through the system. We have it literally formatted in the stylization of the subway, and it looks like you're going down a line, excuse me. And the way we thought of that is, okay, let's think of this as taking the reader on a journey and utilizing the photos and video and data visualizations and pull quotes all to that effect. So the placement really came of okay, where's this gonna have the most impact? We're just walking into the subway, let's have some clips of people walking by, empty retail locations, we're introducing our sources, and let's have some photos of who these people are, them milling around their shops. So I think it became trying to make it an organic, what's the most, how can I get the reader to very easily consume this, just go on and make it an effortless journey for them and make it the most engaging as possible. So that was a conversation that we were always having about placement, and what made the most sense for the story.
And I see Maia nodding over there. So Jared, Maia, do you have anything to add?
I can just talk about something a bit similar similar, but we took a slightly different approach in terms of how we wanted to walk our readers on the digital side, and I'll let Jared speak to the broadcast side through our story. So we designed an immersive digital page for our initial story, and at the top, you know, when you visit this page, you're first inundated by footage of flooding in Shiloh. So it kind of brings you in the way that we were brought into the story. And as we were designing this page, I was thinking about, you know, this story has so many aspects, and if I were reading it, I would be thinking, how did you find this out, or how do you know this, or, you know, who says that? And so I wanted to walk readers through our reporting process and make it as transparent as possible, allow them to engage in the primary sources that we did. And so that involved embedding documents, like some of the ones I mentioned earlier, throughout the story when we mentioned the public meetings or mentioned the contractor's records. It had maps, satellite maps of the highway and imagery before and after, data visualizations also. And so that was a way of kind of allowing the reader to engage interactively. We had interactive data visualizations, and they could click and see more documents. And I wanted to, the goal of this was twofold. One, I think we all know that kind of trust in media is something we have to work to build up and is at risk. And the more transparent we are and the more we show our readers, this is how we did all this work in fact checking and sourcing to come to the conclusions that we're sharing with you. I think that's really important for trust building. And then it also allows them to engage in the work and in the story in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. You know, they have to kind of be an observer. But when they can look through the documents and see the handwritten notes, I think it has a really powerful effect on readers.
Definitely. Again, Maia did a great job of making sure that, you know, the digital piece is a unique feature in and of itself. So the multi-platform package that you mentioned is important that, you know, all the individual pieces go hand in hand. So the digital component, the broadcast component, we also had an audio component because our correspondent Steve Sami, who did a part of an episode of Start Here, which is our morning news podcast at ABC News, we devoted part of it to this issue. So all three of those go hand in hand. And if you're a member of the audience who really wants to, you know, learn all about the Shiloh community, you can watch all three together, and, you know, all three components go really well. But if you only want to see one, you just want to read the digital article, that will tell you what you need to know. You just want to watch the broadcast piece, that will tell you all you need to know. What's also important for us, and we're fortunate here at ABC having these resources, and we were talking about earlier amongst ourselves, if you were here last night, you just saw the number of people whose names were on the screen when our story came up, is that it really does take a village for us to be able to do these pieces. You know, Maia and I were producing the story, and Steve was, you know, the correspondent for it. But we had a whole team of audio engineers in the field, of photographers, of the editor, who's actually, you know, editor means a different thing in TV than it does in print. So the editor who's actually like stitching the actual videos together. Our digital team, you know, our legal and standards team, our attorneys who had to review everything. You know, it really is a big team effort for us to be able to do a multi-platform package like this, but we felt it was worth it for this story.
And Anna, is there something you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, for, you know, sexual assault stories, it can be challenging because they're anonymous victims. But for the gymnastics coach story, we had a visual illustrator that did this amazing piece that was at the start of our story, on top of our story, with a, you know, small gymnast and a coach watching. It was pretty powerful. And we also embedded documents into the story and had photos of the public officials that we were holding accountable for this.
Right. Is it okay to get one more question, Ralph?
Sure.
Or anybody? Yes, sir.
I have a question for each of the panelists, but I think it's a quick question. How many pieces did each of you write for those stories you mentioned in total, as of today?
My story was one feature piece, yeah.
I think we had about 17. The first story was obviously the biggest one, but then, you know, the community was outraged. We had a town hall. The women going back to the police was another story. The police collaborating with the bigger Miami-Dade entity on the investigation was another story. And then there was pre-trial detention hearings. You know, it just kept kind of snowballing. and we're still on top of it.
I think Maia said, I think we had 6 digital pieces, plus 2 broadcast pieces, plus the audio. Is there anything I'm missing?
We had also, the interesting thing with multi-platform for broadcast is when you're creating video stories for multiple different shows, like Good Morning America, or World News Tonight, or ABC News Live Crime, you have different audiences and you have different time constraints. So when we say we had 2 broadcast pieces, we probably actually had, I don't know how many different versions, but each of our stories, there might be a 2-minute version that focuses on this aspect, and there might be a 3 or 4-minute version that gets a little more in the weeds, and then you have your long form 12-minute version is the longest we do. That's very long for us. So there's also some kind of variety within the different cuts.
Well, right, yeah, and depending on the story, I think that follow through is important, because sometimes I've noticed some folks try to leave you out. Like, you do a big investigation and sometimes nothing happens because, like, you didn't follow through, and then they just, so. But, yeah, thank you so much. This was a really great panel. Like, I learned a lot, even at my age, so thank you so much, guys. I appreciate it.